Well, hi everyone. It's lovely to be here again. And today I'm with a dear friend of mine, Tammy Klotz, who is the CISO of Trinseo over in the eastern states of the USA. And I come to you from a slightly sunburnt Australia, as the sun is rather shining as it always does here. And we're here today to talk about a number of interesting topics that Tammy and I have been discussing over cups of coffee and just as general collaborators in the industry. But Tammy, before I begin, could you share with everyone your background? Because it's such an interesting back history and story that you've got and has brought you where you are today.
Sure, absolutely, Dan. I'm happy to share. So I am a 30 plus year veteran of the IT industry, if you will. I spent my first 24 years at an industrial gas company called Air Products, which you may or may not be aware of. But in that organization, I had several different roles within the IT organization. And then my last opportunity there was actually in our internal audit department, where I took on the role of the IT audit manager and learned a whole lot about, what the board of directors is interested in. I learned a little bit more about how the company operates and the importance of controls. And as a result of that, one of the things that we had done is we actually had conducted a cybersecurity and maturity assessment sponsored by internal audit of the organization. So that essentially became my launch into the cybersecurity industry. And Air Products had hired a new CEO, and he had decided that he was going to focus on the industrial gas component of the business of Air Products, and he shed and we spun off the chemicals division. So as a result of that, there were essentially two formations that happened. Part of the chemical business went to a company called Evonik. The rest of the organization went and spun up as its own company called Versum Materials, which was focused on the chemical manufacturing for the semiconductor industry. So it was in that organization that I took my first dip into the role of CISO, if you will, with a lot of encouragement from the current CIO at that point in time. And it was an amazing experience with being a new company. It was essentially a greenfield startup. We were able to approach things from a very progressive perspective. So doing things like zero trust before it was cool, or BYOD before everybody was doing it. And this was in 2016. So well before the days of COVID, which really positioned us well when the pandemic did hit. After a couple of years, Versum was actually acquired by Merck Darmstadt, Germany. So at that point in time, it was my opportunity to pursue a new CISO opportunity. I left Versum and went to a company called Covanta Energy, so a different type of manufacturing. We were a waste to energy organization where we were essentially recycling household waste into energy to supply to the community. So a very sustainable business organization, but certainly with a lot of different risks than I had experienced previously at Versum. And I stayed there for about 3 years. And then I took a bit of a pause and took some personal time for myself and my family. And during that time, that is when I started on my book. And I released a book just this past April. And just in October of 2023, I took on my third CISO opportunity at a company called Trinseo, which I'm currently at today. And I am once again back in the chemical manufacturing space, focused on the resins business now. And it feels a little bit like I've come back home to my roots, if you will, from an Air Products perspective in Versum. But it's really been an interesting journey because a lot of the different learnings and experiences have served me quite well as I continue on developing the program here at Trinseo.
That's a huge backstory and a lot of learning and a lot of lessons learned. I think of it. We must just plug the book, Tammy, because it's got a very appropriate title. Do share it with us.
Sure. The title of the book is actually Leading with Empathy and Grace.
We're going to come on to that because that's something that you and I have discussed quite a few times, and it's something our industry perhaps needs to consider, but come to that in a minute. We were talking about resilience,
Mhm.
organizational and cyber resilience. And obviously that's a theme on the top of so many CISOs' minds these days. Tell me, where are we sitting as an industry on this, and what concerns you about resilience, or perhaps a lack of it in many places?
Yeah, I think the key points around resilience, we've all heard the cliche statements in our industry around, it's not if, but when. And I think, the corollary to that from a resiliency perspective is it's not what, but it's how. Because a lot of that resiliency comes in regards to, when you find yourself in a situation, in the middle of an incident, in the middle of a breach. It's all about how you're going to react and respond to that situation, if you will. And that, in fact, determines how you are perceived by your customers, by the public, by media, with regards to I'll even say transparency, to the extent that we are able to be transparent with regards to what is actually happening without sacrificing confidentiality of the company and such. But the ability to respond and recover becomes so much more important. And you can put as much into the organization from a controls perspective, from a tools perspective, but inevitably, if somebody wants to get in, they're going to get in. And if we keep our eyes wide open to that, and embrace that as kind of our, mode of operations in our daily practices, I think that positions us much better from a success perspective. And I've gotten a lot of feedback, as I've gone through, whether it's uh, conversations with insurance brokers and providers, or whether it's conversations with auditors who are doing maturity assessments. This isn't about, painting a rosy picture. This is about painting a factual picture, and acknowledging where there are gaps. The last thing that, we want to do is paint a picture that somebody thinks, yep, it's all under control and nothing's ever going to happen here, because that is not reality. And you will set yourselves up for failure if you do not address that elephant in the room, if you will. So I'll just tie it back to resiliency. And it's, you talked about in our industry as well as from an organizational perspective as well. The folks who are, on the front line fighting the cyber attacks and the cyber, the bad actors, it's hard work, right? And acknowledging that is extremely important. It's a high burnout industry. And you need to keep that in mind as you're developing your teams, determining, who needs a break, who, do we need to kind of shift some resources around? How do we staff our organizations so that the organization itself can continue to be resilient and have that endurance, and the wherewithal to continue to look at the alerts, to look at trends in data, to look at, well, all of these attacks are coming in from an email perspective and they're targeting, a specific country. Does that have is there an underlying message there or concern that we need to be researching and thinking? So it's really about that critical thinking, and not just looking at an alert, but that compilation of data that allows us to be resilient, to be at one step ahead of where the attacker might be heading.
It's interesting you say an alert. Over the last 6 months, I've seen a number of scenarios where purple teaming is being used, as we've discussed, like to prove the effectiveness of controls and the sort of the efficacy of that as well. I saw a post today on social media and they actually used the word efficacy, which I thought was a really cool descriptor. And very interesting. People still think very binary. They may be able to detect and respond to an alert. But then what was fascinating to see, there was no resilience across the chain saying, well, hold on, there's another one here. Could the two correlated? Have you seen the same sorts of things?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think, as you try to develop that single pane of glass to be able to look at multiple environments at the same time and really deduce if there is a message that's there that you need to pick up on. It's almost very like detective like to really be able to put those pieces of the puzzle together, because one alert is not going to tell you, you know, what's going on, right? It's the multiplicity, it's the similarity, it's the locality that potentially starts to paint that picture. And you need folks who are focused and able to troubleshoot and problem solve. And I'll even say puzzle solve, right? Because a lot of that is, you know, putting these pieces together to really understand what's going on.
Puzzle solving. That's a lovely way of putting it. Now tell me, is the puzzle solved through technology?
Uh, Partially.
Okay.
It's, you know, again, we'll use I guess the well-known phrase in the industry, people, process, and technology, right? And certainly I'm a big advocate, if you think to the title of book, with empathy, you know, it's about the people, right? And I think that's where we need to start. To make sure that our people are trained and skilled properly, that they are empowered to be able to ask questions, to, you know, present scenarios, to in some cases take risks as well, with the proper endorsement and recognition by the leaders of the organization, the teammates of the organization, so that they can explore what's actually going on. So it's the people are probably the most important thing in my opinion. And I'll follow with process then, right? Because a lot of times, you know, there can be, if you think of things like a business email compromise and, you know, maybe something has made its way into your system because it was a relatively benign email, but it was used to develop a relationship based upon, you know, an existing relationship, and then essentially trick somebody, you know, very subtly into, you know, sending money to the wrong bank account, for example. And in those situations, that the process is just as important to ensure that the controls are working as they're supposed to be. So that, you know, if there's a request for a bank change, that somebody is going through the right steps of the process to actually verify that. And having it approved, perhaps by not only themselves, but by a secondary approver as well, to ensure that those processes are followed as well. And then following that up with technology, obviously, we can have all the greatest tools in the book, right? And that's definitely going to help protect your organization. But if that tool is not configured properly, if you have multiple tools that are stepping on each other and perhaps are not performing like you think they should be performing, you know, solely relying on tools to be your line of defense is a little dangerous, if you ask me, because if without people in process and being able to look at the specificity of those tools, you could end up behind an attack, and it will not be a nice situation.
Well, the reason I smile, Tammy, is what you said. I mean, stepping on each other's tools, I think is a really, really cool way of putting
Mm,
things. There's a lot of that over tooling, but that kind of efficacy or effectiveness of controls is such a missing link, and something that we see now, day in, day out, is are people being breached because of some, you know, bug specific, you know, lack
mhm,
or, you know, application vulnerability, or is it a failure of the defensive tool set or process or people or
mhm.
the chain therein? And it's alarming how many people invest so much in all of the above, yet it fails because they don't then look at that next stage, which is how do I implement that and how do I maintain its currency? So I've got a question related to that. You mentioned the words empowered and enabled. Surely
Mhm.
aren't defensive teams both already? I mean, that's a bit of a leading question, of course.
It is, and I would agree with that. I think um, you can say that they are, but in the event that, you know, they're bringing perhaps something to the table that is a little bit uncomfortable, or risk adverse in some cases. Some folks may challenge them. And in some cases, depending upon, who they're presenting their quote case to, it may be frowned upon, as, that's not how we do things here. But I think it's a matter of how you turn the situation into a benefit. So I'll give you a specific example, right?
Mm.
So at one of my organizations, we had a compromise of a MFA token, right? And it was really a result of somebody being annoyed by the alerts that were coming through on their phone. It was set up as an accept or deny, and they got tired of it, and they were sitting in front of their computer, and they hit accept, and obviously they gave away the last key to get in the door, if you will.
Mm.
And as a result of that, what we chose to do there organizationally is we turned that into a learning opportunity, right? Which in some cases, folks were like, oh, we can't do that, and we didn't name and shame the individual with regards to what had happened, but it was more around, this is what can happen. This is what does happen. And yes, it did happen here. So you need to be very alert and aware of the different types of behaviors. And there's the statement that, your employees are always your weakest link in your defense from a cyber attack. And I don't condone that. And I will not use that ever in my program development. So I always switch that to your people are your strongest link, need to be your strongest link. So a lot of the work that I've done, which is pretty atypical, is around, doing, I'll say behavior-based controls, having folks really focused on their training and awareness, making it consumable, making it digestible, not making it a 45-minute course that, people wrinkle their nose at, right? And make it relatable to them, not only from a corporate perspective, but from a personal perspective as well. And the more you build on that type of awareness, I think you position your entire workforce to be more cognizant of the risks that are faced every day in our industry.
Okay, there's a lot to unpack there, but I think something I really want to delve into, which is something I want to develop more in this series now, which is not just experience, but practical advice, Tammy. If
Mhm.
you were sitting there with other peer CISOs, security professionals, and had to deal with that scenario, you mentioned people have found something but are uncomfortable, yet they sit in a defensive part of the organization, then there's clearly a major issue here.
Mhm.
The practical and typical steps you would encourage organizations to do to find that, root that out, and create then foster that environment where if something is bad, it is actually acted on, because that's an extraordinary scenario, really, but very common.
Mhm. Yeah. So I, I I think from, the folks who are having to defend the organization, it's, yes, they're recognized for their role and what they do. I
Mm.
struggle when the work that they do is, perhaps not appreciated as much as it should be organizationally, without the respect for what they're actually doing. Because a lot of times, folks it's operational in nature, right? It's keeping the lights on. And I think from a security operations perspective, it's a tad bit different, right? Because it is about preventing the next thing from happening.
Mm.
And that is the piece that needs to be recognized organizationally. And they have to be given the cycles to be able to do that as well. And you have to be staffed in order to do that also.
Oh, now that's a challenge. How on earth do you staff this? Because the experience and the depth required is vast, isn't it? People tier them out into different, T1, 2, 3, whatever.
Mhm.
Um, that has its own weaknesses as well, doesn't it? You got people who can miss something that's, they regard as a low and is actually a precursor to something extremely serious. How do we deal with
Sure.
that?
Um, Experience. I think if, one of the things that I adopted at Covanta is we had this concept of accountability partners within the team. right? So not only were you responsible for your own goals and objectives, you were partnered with somebody else in the organization who was complementary to your skill set, but then also held you accountable for what the partnership needed to contribute to the organization or the goals, right? So that actually ended up working out extremely well. I mean, it won't work in every situation depending upon the size and the skills of such, but there were some natural pairings that happened. I had my network engineer focused on OT security work with the enterprise network engineer, right? And there's different requirements on both sides of that equation. But the two of them, I would say complemented each other, and they were able to assist. And it also helped from a resiliency perspective. If one of them was out, the other could cover. So it was like an inherent backup plan and model that we worked. And then essentially, they were each recognized as an individual contributor to the organization. And I met with each of them one-on-one, but then separately, we did accountability partner meetings. And it was okay, like, what's going on? Are you guys, girls, working okay together? Is there anything that I can do to help you be more successful? So it's a much more engaging type of conversation, and it promotes and fosters that accountability as well as a teamwork approach.
Safety and no politics, right? Enabler.
Yes, absolutely.
That, I mean,
100%.
if you just think about that, the fact that we've even had to say that, isn't that why, bad actors sit there and must laugh sometimes and take such advantage of the fact that organizations build these defensive controls, they build the resilience, they staff it, they spend years training in it, but their own politics gets in the way of them looking
Puts
after
them away.
themselves. Back in they go.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Quite
Yes.
extraordinary, isn't it? There is we've seen, we don't agree with organizations that take quite a disciplinary approach
Mm.
to a user, whoever they may be, being phished, even with some quite sophisticated means. I mean, some of these, as you know, we've both seen them, have been extraordinary architectures that make this stuff possible, and multi
Mm-hmm.
in their approach. It's absolutely the wrong way, wouldn't you agree, to focus on that? I mean, how can a victim is a victim by definition of the phrase, right?
Right. Right. I it's the proverbial carrot and stick approach, right? So, as going back to my example where you turn a bad situation into a learning opportunity, right? It's similar on this front. So you could name and shame, you could apply disciplinary action. And my approach is really around, you get to make a mistake once. You don't get make the same mistake a second time, right? So if you think of it from a training and awareness perspective, we did some very interesting things with recognition, right? So it wasn't about this is how many people clicked on the link, but here are the top 5 fishers, right, who actually reported the link. And then every month or every campaign, there was recognition of who they were. And then there was an internal recognition program that we were able to award them medals and things like that, and some points, and then they could buy something from the company store, right? So, little things like that, got people engaged. Cybersecurity Awareness Month, there was a scavenger hunt that we did, right? And folks had to go look for the answers, and they got codes to advance to the next level. And then there was a prize for, the individual who was randomly chosen from the submissions who had gotten, made their way through the hunt successfully. So if you can change the intent from a recognition to a discipline perspective, I think, there's definitely value in doing that. And it's back to that focus on people, the empathy, grace, etc. is just, it can benefit you way more than you ever expected, right? And some of it is not measurable. That's the challenge, right? It's more that how does it make you feel, as opposed to, how many people clicked, right? So it's a very different approach.
Absolutely. And these, what do they say? There's in the aviation world, there's no rewards for a good landing. And how many organizations look and say, how many times did we dodge this? How many times were
Right.
our people and process side effective?
Hmm.
Which
Yeah.
is kind of
And
kind of interesting.
yeah, I think one of the interesting questions that I've been asked over the years, are we really that good or are we lucky?
Tammy, is this lock in cybersecurity? Wow. Wow, that's a very interesting question, isn't it? Now, I must come on to something else that you shared. We were brainstorming the other week, and we were talking about, just go back to the technology piece now, sheer overload and
Hmm.
vulnerabilities everywhere. Everyone's talking about vulnerabilities, and then you hear this kind of alarming term of saturation, which is, something that we're all occurring every single day
Hmm.
now. Um, Interestingly, no one ever speaks about the failures of controls saturation, but that's, I suppose, the negative opposite. Much as you can't put on a dashboard or a pane of glass, user empathy either, but they're
Hmm.
incredibly important. But you said something else, which I was intrigued at, that CISOs often, and you talk to a lot of CISOs yourself, and CISOs are finding this stuff a nuisance. What a word. What a troubling word, huh? Tell me more.
Hmm. Yeah, so it's interesting to me because I didn't think of the impact when I described it at that, but definitely you and I have talked about that a little bit more now. And it is, right? It's something that has to be dealt with. You can't ignore it. But how do you manage your way through the morass of, volume of vulnerabilities that are out there, right? And if you're doing it right, you're looking across the entire landscape of your organization, and the vulnerabilities that are coming in are probably fast and furious. And if you're wanting to show progress, um, it can sometimes be an uphill battle, right? Because you take the top 10 off the list and the next 10 show up, right? So it's a never ending cycle that we find ourselves in, being able to do that. And then I think the other piece of that is, just figuring out how to uh, respond to those vulnerabilities, how to mitigate them, how do you risk rank them, which ones do I have to go after first? Do these even apply to us, right? And if you take the OT component into effect as well, that offers a whole nother set of challenges because I don't have the ability in some cases to patch as often as I would need to in those situations. So then you end up having to have a different conversation about, okay, well, there's some exposure here on this particular system. We know there's a vulnerability, but is it enough to shut the system down? Or
Mm.
do we want to take the risk, and run for a period of time? What are our other controls that are protecting this particular system? So that it allows you to have a very different conversation about risk, taking the risk, vulnerability mitigation. But yeah, they are a nuisance, right? It's, they have to be dealt with one way or the other. You can't wave a magical wand and they're all going to be gone. So there's some methodology that needs to go into action so that you're doing it in a structured fashion and not constantly spinning, so that you make progress. And then progress is often tampered because as soon as you take some off the list, more get at it, right? So it's an arduous process to stay on top of those.
So I ask a very interesting question, a conundrum. Is our
Hmm.
industry losing confidence in vulnerability management?
Losing confidence. I I I don't. That's a really good question. I don't think they're losing confidence. I do believe um, we may be struggling more with what is the right approach, right? Because they know that it's oftentimes a metric, right, that is used to say this is how vulnerable we are in our environment. This is how many high risk vulnerabilities there are, right? So I don't think the industry itself is either doubting it, but it's definitely a challenge. And then you have to think about what message is it actually sending, right?
Mm.
So if I have, I don't know, 2,000 low risk vulnerabilities in my environment, you've got to be pretty clear of what your strategy is. Do we mitigate those or do we not? Right? Are we addressing them, or are we only looking at high vulnerabilities? So I don't. Yeah, it's a tough one, right? It's kind of like a necessary evil, right? We've got to do it. We need insight into the environment, and it'll go back to it's not what, but how we decide to attack it.
That's interesting. So on that word of insight, I guess the phrase is, who says it's high? Interesting,
Fair
hey?
enough. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yep. Who says it's high? And that's a question of governance. Who does get to say that, right? And I think, when these CVEs are coming out, the vendors themselves will assess them from a risk perspective and the criticality of those vulnerabilities. But there's still the conversation that needs to happen, right? If it's, and a lot of my security background is in OT, as I've referenced to that in our operational technology and manufacturing. But it you're required to have a conversation, right? And sometimes that's lost on a lot of people because they just want to take care of it. Um, or somebody's going to go, oh, well, you have 200 vulnerabilities in your you know Emerson systems across the board. Is that a problem? Well, I don't know. This is what could happen. And then you have a conversation of, are you willing to accept the risk that may or may not happen? If we do this, if we do patch it and fix the vulnerability, does it go away? Is there any residual risk that remains? So you have an engaging conversation with essentially the business owner that jointly you make a decision. So I view our roles as risk advisors,
Right.
and the business is the risk acceptor.
Very interesting you take that perspective. And there's another one which has come up so many times of late as well, which is all these things, the scanners produce stuff on glass, right? And gives us metrics that are tangible, 200, 2,000, whatever it might be.
Exactly. Yes. Hmm.
But people love to put their hand on something because it is tangible. What
And it's
about
quantitative. It's quantitative.
exactly, exactly. So then we get pulled into this and we see another further dimension behind that, which is processing data. So security and cyber organizations now are spending so much time becoming data aggregators and analysts, and they're pulling them away from the core
Hmm.
problem. So I'll pose a sort of final question to you, which is the all this vulnerability data, it creates something that pulls us towards it because it's tangible and quantifiable, as you say.
Hmm.
But what's your view that we've got all these controls in place, let's call them EDRs and SOCs and all that stuff, but there's no CVSS for the fact that a SOC didn't pick up a password spray attack from 3 different locations that you don't operate in.
Hmm.
But there's nothing on glass that says that. There's no metric that says that
Correct.
you missed this one, huh?
Yep.
How do
Yep.
we deal with that, Tammy, as the final question here? It's such a challenge.
Well, and I think that's where, you really need to think about that um, from I'll take it back to staffing, right? Because if you have an internal team, they're really probably just looking out for your company,
Yes.
right? And yes, they've got to do their research and they've got to know what's going on in the wild, or what bleeping computer is saying, but something happened, right? But if you look at the larger organizations that are providing, whether it's SOC as a service or something like that, they're looking kind of across the world, right? Different industries, different populations. And they're seeing a lot more things because there are multiple customers that they're trying to protect, and keep the events from occurring in those situations. So um it it's challenging because there's the data component of our industry, right? Are you working with your data analytics team? Are you looking at trends? But the trends that are internal is just one set of data. You've
Right.
got to be able to take the data from what's going on in the rest of the world and figuring out where you fit into that data pool.
So I have to pose one final little micro question to the end of that. Is this stuff best done inside or externally? There's the
Um,
question.
it, the $1 million question, right? I think it depends. Honestly, it's going to depend upon the size of your organization. It's going to depend on the industry that you're in, right? So if you think about, highly regulated, highly compliant organizations, those I personally think they're best served by the bigger organizations who have a broader span, and can see beyond the walls of, just your company, if you will. If it's a small business, I think, you can have you can have that done internally, but you've got to have the right people that are filling that role then, because it can't just be folks who are, checking the box, right? They're going to be needing to be trolling and looking outside and seeing what's going on. So I think both models can work depending upon those parameters, the industry, the size of the company, the risk to the company. And it's also how much can you afford? Two people internally is probably not nearly what you're going to get for a SOC as a service type model, right? So there's some trade-offs there also. But it's important to think about that from a skills perspective, from a coverage perspective. That becomes part of your, business case for how you proceed.
Absolutely a multidimensional decision, really, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Mm.
100%.
Tammy, this is, as always, fascinating conversation. I'd like to thank you for your time again today, and I look forward to our next cup of tea together and trying
Excellent.
stuff around and working it all out. But for the moment, Tammy Klotz, CISO of Trinseo, thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Dan. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.